There we go. So yeah, I'm Forrest Moulton. I work for the Lincoln Ranger District. I'm in charge of the recreation program there. But I worked at Spotted Bear for a long time, and I've also worked with the Swan Lake Ranger District. So I've kind of been around the Bob Marshall complex. And I've been involved with a lot of our manager meetings in regards to the limits of susceptible change framework. So yeah, I'll just give a little background, which Jack already mentioned that he was part of this rec management direction that it was the first time LAC was implemented as kind of like the pilot program. And since then it's been adopted on many wilderness areas and outside of wilderness. But for the Bob Marshall, that rec management direction in 1987 was the first implementation of it. And Jack also kind of mentions a different approach to carrying capacity. It's trying to ask not how many people is too much, but how much change from the ideal is too much. So with that, we established indicators and standards for resource and social conditions. So that's stuff like trail encounters or campsite conditions. And then we'd have standards that if we exceed over time those, like the impact rating for the campsites or seeing too many people on the trail, then there's a myriad options that as managers we have to try to get our standards back in line. Kind of like everyone likes to talk about permits, but that's, if you look at our LAC management direction, it's kind of like the last option is what we're going to those more restrictive management actions. So taking it into the present, we had a 10-year wilderness stewardship challenge, which I think was implemented in like 2017 or 18. And with that, the Forest Service is trying to get all wildernesses kind of on board in the same management style. And the big thing with that is wilderness character monitoring. That's part of the wilderness stewardship challenge. So that's kind of like the newest iteration of LAC is wilderness character monitoring. And luckily for us, we were already doing with LAC a lot of what is involved with wilderness character monitoring. So like some of the things I mentioned earlier, the solitude encounters monitoring and campsite condition monitoring. And then along with with that wilderness character monitoring initiative, there's been some minimum protocols on how to implement, especially solitude, but also like campsite stuff. But so for the minimum protocol we're supposed to be following, we had to adjust our LAC solitude monitoring protocol a little bit. So I just wanted to briefly mention some of this stuff that it's all aimed to get our data collection more in line with visitor use. So it's trying to improve our data collection. So in the past, our monitoring areas weren't super representative of visitor use. They were more, it was like sections of trails broken up by geo units, which were like an arbitrary dividing line. It was very complicated, and we're essentially having like multiple monitoring areas that people would inventory in a single day. So now we've had the whole complex go through and create different monitoring areas that are more representative of visitor use. So like on my district, a good example is like the mainline trail that goes around a lake, as opposed to in the past, that would have been like 3 monitoring areas because it's 2 separate trails. So it's just, we're trying to have these monitoring areas be more representative of what the public would do in a day. And then we're also adding a time component to data collection. So when we aggregate the data, it's more correlated. Because in the past, sometimes we'd just be collecting data for like 30 minutes. And that isn't really representative of an entire day, but we were counting it as that. And we also need to spend a minimum of 4 hours in a monitoring area to actually implement data collection. And this is all done from this minimum protocol that Troy Hall, she was like social scientist that was doing a lot of the research that went into this minimum protocol. And some other things is we're just counting all groups and camps seen, not just the people we passed on the trail. That's how we used to be collecting data. Whereas when you ask people if their experience was impacted by seeing people in camps or like bright pack rafts on the river, that influences their experience just as much as passing people on the trail, or it might even influence their experience more. And then, yeah, so for the campsite encounters, that's a different indicator. We're also trying to target mornings and evenings for data collection because that's when you're more likely to contact folks. So overall, with this minimum protocol and wilderness character modeling, we're just trying to improve our data collection of what we're already doing with LAC. Yeah, and then the second effort we're undertaking in the complex is modernizing data collection. So we are working with a Forest Service enterprise team to modernize our database and develop apps for data collection. Might seem counterintuitive that we're using phones and tablets to collect data in the wilderness, but as you'll see, it'll improve our data collection, and it'll just make compiling that data and making reports from it so much easier. So yeah, and that's kind of where our partners will tie into with these new apps. We're hoping, I talked to Bill Hodge, who's been on the call, about trying to do some of this data collection with tablets, or even you can just use a personal phone. So we're hoping to get more data, better data. Yeah, so the main thing is we're using for the this mapping software, you can see to the right, it has all our campsites and monitoring areas as point data or line data. And when you're in the application, you can just click on those and it'll bring you up to, it'll hyperlink to a Survey 123 app where you can collect the data. And then when you're back in the office, or you get a Wi-Fi or cell signal, you can just sync that with the new ArcPro database. So it's going to be a lot more seamless, less sitting in front of the computer, typing into an old Oracle database. Everything will just sync right in. Yep. And then ideally, the report creations, we're still working on that, but it should give us our evaluation of how we're meeting those standards a lot more easily as well. And so, yeah, here's just an example of the old paper forms for campsite conditions, and then the tablet or phone Survey 123 app, where it even does all the math for you. So there's a lot of fail safes built into it where you can't go on to the next if you didn't do something correctly too. So I think it'll make data collection a lot easier for folks, and they don't have to do math, which is great. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Perfect, thanks, Forrest. And same as the question format that we had before, feel free to ask your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and then we'll call on you and you can ask them verbally. Lots of information to mull over, so we'll give you guys a few seconds to think of some questions here. Oh, I see Jack has his hand up. Jack, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, just one quick question for Forrest. As you do the campsite evaluations, taking into account when we adopted that, when we completed it, and it was adopted in 1987, we started in about, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we started about at least 3 years prior with our group to try to come up with this new management concept. And it's interesting that we penned it off in 1987. And the next year there was an anomaly called the Canyon Creek Fire, along with others in the Bob Marshall, which dramatically changed the landscape. And I don't know whether we would have changed our approach in the wake of that or not. I suspect we would have, because we were dealing with a pretty static landscape that had incredible management interaction, mainly fire suppression, and no fires were allowed to go, natural or otherwise. And so I think we would have changed the way we approached it. And at that time, we thought 1988 was an anomaly. We have since realized that in the last 20 years, that anomaly has occurred more often than not. And not only have we had initial entry fires, but we've had re-entry fires. The landscape and the opportunities to camp with out of sight and sound of people, or even some of the camps that were very safe to camp in, which are now unsafe because of burn snags or disease and fire, or disease and insects. It just changed it. So I say all that to say, to ask you if you guys are taking that into consideration as you try to continue to implement the LAC that we signed off on all those years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we're approaching data collection any different, but you can definitely see those changes in the data, because a lot of those campsites have gone from, like heavy impact, especially I'm thinking of like fires on the South Fork corridor that, all those campsites that just got nuked have gone from like heavy impact or moderate impact to non-discernible. As far as how we're analyzing the data, I guess I would say we haven't really gone that far or like looked into it too much to like see those changes. But I think it'd be interesting to try to get a overlay some of those fire perimeters onto our campsite layers and see how they've changed over time.
Yes, I would think so too. I think that LAC is still very relevant, but it also the whole idea behind it is that it was going to be a dynamic tool that wasn't going to be stagnant. And so those are things that I haven't had a chance to look over all the data, but there are a lot of campsite choices that have changed as a result of not necessarily people's wishes, but just the landscape changed. Fire and disease and insects have altered a lot of camp spots in a way that it's changed. And the idea of LAC when we adopted it was that we would try to develop trends, and we wouldn't have knee-jerk reactions to a condition that was unacceptable. And the next year we would change it. We would watch to see if it was an anomaly or a trend, whether it was a use pattern or a campsite impact or what that was. So I just questioning how when you guys sit down and analyze the data, how you take it, what you do from there, and how much do you put into the things to be natural changes that we didn't do. So
yeah, no, that'd be interesting. And I would say, we have several areas that are over standard for like campsite density, some of those standards for the campsite data. So yeah, we're always talking about what to do about that, because we do have a lot of very popular areas. I'm sure you're aware that there's so many campsites within I think it's 640 acre radius that we're dealing with for those standards.
yes.
And a lot of that, it's just because, like you said, folks are going to you're getting bumped from one area where there's a big fire to the areas that's still green. So
Yeah,
I think
I don't
as
know.
far as priority for management to like implement decisions based on those areas being over standard, we haven't gone there yet.
Okay. An interesting thing I think to take into consideration would be where the 88 fire burned and throughout the Bob Marshall in various places. Some of the regen in those areas may have grown up enough to now places where people quit camping, now they're starting to camp again, which could actually help towards dispersing use out of some of those heavily used areas. And so I would think that time would be something that we really want to take into consideration, where you a fire burns and 20 years later, when you get 25-foot regen, have use patterns change back according to that. And some of that can only be done with a long collection of data. So I would encourage the data to not just be reflected in 5-year, but take a 30-year look at it and say, what effect did fire and disease and insects have on use patterns, and has it, and as they regen and things like that happen, how does it change back? I think that would be worthwhile to keep an eye on that and track that.
Great point, Jack. I hate to interject in here. I just want to get to a few more questions before we start wrapping up for the day. So I think, Bill, you had a question as well, and then I see some in the chat, so I'll try to get to as many as we can before we leave for the day.
I think it's just a question for the group, really, because we gather all this data, but from my experience, participation and the limits of acceptable change meetings is dwindled to something resembling zero. And I think we need to change that. We need to find a way to get the public more engaged in helping the agency figure out how to respond to this data, whether, to Jack's point, whether we wait and see data over a longer time span before making decisions, but just wondering how we can pull the public. We're talking about wanting to engage more of the public, but how we get the public more involved in saying, well, here's the trends we're seeing. What's the feedback? And certainly the very engaged public, all outfitters and guides, that sort of thing. Having enough people show up has been a real challenge, I think, and we need to figure out creative ways to get the public involved again.
Perfect. Thanks, Bill. Mike, I see you have your hand up, so we'll come to you first, and then there's quite a few questions in the chat. So I think maybe, Forrest, if you could take a few minutes afterwards just to answer some of those questions to the best of your ability, that would probably be the best way to go with that one.
Thank you, Holly. And yeah, Forrest, there's more than a half dozen in the chat that you'll probably want to respond with some detailed info. But Bill, to what you're speaking of, we are starting to look at doing some things relative to the Chinese wall, both the south and north. And a lot of it has to do with some of our campsite inventory that we've been doing through LAC. And to the point that we're going to be looking at changing or carving out a new resource area that will focus on the wall. And the reason I share that is because I think one of the greatest ways we're going to get more participation from the public at large, as well as permit holders, is if we act on some of the information we have that I know is going to be somewhat controversial. I know that'll get people involved. And then just to respond to Jack, there are some perceived negative parts about fire affecting recreation, especially related to hazard trees and focusing more people camping in more congregated places because of the fact that we're not able to open all the secondary trails. But there's also a lot of people that are seeing beneficial impacts from the amount of grass that has come back. And if they're heavy stock users, it makes a big difference for where they want to be in terms of their recreating too. And that tends to be more dispersed in terms of looking at things. So I just wanted to interject that with the opportunity I had.